Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that is, well, not exactly uplifting. So if you've already brushed your teeth, set your phone to do not disturb and tuck yourself in. Then let's glide slowly back into early 18th century Europe, where powdered wigs were a thing. Everyone smelled faintly of horse, and royal medicine consisted mostly of just bleed him again and see what happens. Our main character tonight is Emperor Joseph I of Austria, a Habsburg emperor, naturally. And if you know the Habsburgs, you know what's coming. Inbreeding, jawlines that could slice bread, and lots of illnesses. Joseph I, however, didn't die of just any old cough or cold. He died of syphilis, which, to put it politely, is not the most glamorous way for a Holy Roman Emperor to bow out. But don't worry, we're not going to rush. Tonight we'll take our time, floating gently through his childhood, his not-so-sparkling reign, and the slow, rotting decline of his body. Because nothing says bedtime like the tragic story of a man literally decaying while everyone around him politely pretended he looked fine. So let's start where all Habsburg tragedies start, in a palace, surrounded by too much velvet and far too many portraits of stern ancestors. Joseph I was born in 1678 in Vienna into the very large and very tangled Habsburg family tree. His father was Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, who had one of those faces that screamed, "I've been inbred for 16 generations straight." Leopold had the famous Habsburg chin, a chin so prominent it looked like it was trying to escape his face. His mother, Margarita Teresa of Spain, came from the Spanish branch of the family, which was also busy recycling the same genes until they squeaked. So from day one, Joseph was genetically challenged. But unlike many Habsburg children, Joseph actually survived infancy, which was kind of a big deal. His father had so many babies that died within weeks of birth that it was basically a family tradition. Joseph, though, made it past the dangerous baby years. He even grew into what people described as a handsome young man, which, again, when applied to Habsburgs, usually just means he didn't look like a melted candle. Now, Joseph wasn't expected to be particularly exceptional. He was the eldest son, so he was destined to inherit the Holy Roman Empire, whether or not he was any good at it. His education was fine. Tutors drilled him in Latin, theology, politics, and how to look pious while doing absolutely nothing useful. Standard emperor curriculum. He also had the usual royal hobbies: hunting, music, pretending to be religious, and getting into trouble with women. That last one would become important later, because here's the thing about Joseph. He was a bit of a party guy. He liked women a lot, which wouldn't have been such a problem except for the fact that his taste in women was not exactly exclusive. Mistresses, chambermaids, ladies-in-waiting, basically anyone who hung around court was fair game. And as you might imagine, in a world without penicillin, this was not a healthy lifestyle choice. But before we get ahead of ourselves with the whole syphilis situation, let's linger a bit on Joseph as a young emperor-in-waiting, when he was crowned king of the Romans, which is basically the title given to the heir of the Holy Roman Emperor. Not an actual king of Rome, people were impressed. He had charisma, he was tall, he looked good in shiny armor. He was the sort of young Habsburg who made people think, finally, one who doesn't look like death warmed over. He also had a certain charm that his father definitely did not. Leopold, I was dour, rigid, and looked like he permanently smelled something bad. Joseph, by contrast, could actually smile. He even enjoyed theater and music, and he was known for being less uptight than your average Habsburg, which in royal terms meant he might actually laugh once in a while. Marriage, of course, came next, because dynasties don't run on love. They run on political alliances. Joseph married Wilhelmine Amelia of Brunswick-Luneburg in 1699, She was 17. He was 21, and they were, on paper, a good match. Wilhelmine Amelia was pious, modest, and dutiful. Joseph was not. Within months of the wedding, he was back to his usual extracurricular activities, and that's where the problem started. Because one of the many, many women Joseph spent time with passed along a little parting gift. A bacterial infection known as Treponema pallidum, or as we know it, syphilis. At first, nobody really panicked. Syphilis was everywhere in early modern Europe. Nobles, priests, soldiers, half the continent probably had it. It was called the French disease, the Italian disease, or just that unpleasant rash thing. But for Joseph, it was more than just an embarrassing problem. It was the start of a slow, humiliating decline. Now, in the early 1700s, medical treatment for syphilis was, let's just say, unhelpful. The main cure was mercury. As in, yes, the toxic metal. Physicians would smear mercury ointment on sores or make patients breathe in mercury vapors. Sometimes they even recommended drinking it. The logic was, it makes you sweat, it makes you salivate. Therefore, the poison must be leaving your body. In reality, of course, you just got mercury poisoning on top of your syphilis. So Joseph spent the next few years being alternately bled, purged, and poisoned by his doctors. Meanwhile, his symptoms worsened. Sores, rashes, pain, fevers. His hair began to thin, his skin broke out, and he became increasingly irritable. But because he was emperor, everyone around him pretended he looked just fine. After all, you couldn't exactly say to the Holy Roman Emperor, "Hey, sire, you're literally rotting." The cruelest twist? Joseph passed the disease to his wife, Wilhelmine Amelia. Through her, it may also have infected their children, which meant not only was Joseph suffering, but his dynasty was as well. 2 of his daughters were born weak and sickly, one of them dying young. The surviving daughter, Maria Josepha, carried the disease with her into her own ill-fated marriage. So thanks to Joseph's wandering eye, the Habsburg gene pool got even murkier. Let's float for a moment, though, and picture the court around him. Vienna in the early 1700s was a glittering but filthy city. The palaces were enormous, dripping with chandeliers, tapestries, and portraits of people with oddly similar faces. At night, the court would gather for banquets, balls, and music. Everyone wore powdered wigs to cover up lice infestations. Perfume was sprayed liberally to mask the lack of bathing. And through all of it, Joseph had to show up and pretend he was still the dashing young emperor people thought he was. But behind the scenes, his body was failing him. His strength waned, his memory faltered, and his temper grew shorter. Courtiers whispered, but no one dared admit what was obvious. The emperor was dying, slowly, painfully, and most humiliating of all, from a disease that everyone associated with scandal and sin. So, where were we? Right, Joseph I, the handsome Habsburg who decided to collect mistresses like trading cards, and who ended up catching the least desirable souvenir of early modern Europe, syphilis. By the early 1700s, his body was already betraying him. But outwardly, the show had to go on. Because when you're emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, which, by the way, was neither holy nor Roman, nor much of an empire, you couldn't just say, "Sorry, I'm sick," cancel the ball. Court life rolled forward in Vienna with endless banquets, hunts, ceremonies, and all the pomp that a crumbling dynasty could afford. Imagine Joseph, powdered wig askew, makeup caked onto sores, limping into a glittering hall while courtiers bowed and scraped as though he were the very image of health. It was basically the royal version of fake it till you make it, except Joseph wasn't going to make it. Now, let's pause on medicine again, because his treatments are too absurd not to linger on. His doctors were deeply committed to mercury. They had him rubbed with mercury ointments until his skin blistered. They made him inhale mercury fumes, which of course poisoned his lungs. And they gave him concoctions to swallow, so his stomach was probably as corroded as the pipes of an old tenement building. The side effects: constant drooling, tremors, and madness. So on top of syphilis literally eating away at him, the cure was essentially turning him into a twitching, babbling mess. And the irony is, people thought this meant the treatment was working. Oh, look, Sire is sweating buckets and shaking uncontrollably. Clearly, the bad humors are leaving his body. Yes, along with any remaining chance of recovery, of course. When mercury didn't seem to be helping, they tried other remedies. Bleeding, obviously. Because why not drain a sick man of what little energy he has left? Laxatives were also popular. Imagine being emperor, trying to run an empire, and constantly excusing yourself because your doctor gave you a gallon of herbal purge that morning. Truly majestic. By 1705, Joseph's father Leopold I died, leaving him the full weight of the empire. Joseph was just 26, young, tall, with that carefully maintained aura of vigor, and a body already collapsing inside. And honestly, Joseph wasn't the worst emperor the Habsburgs ever produced. Which isn't saying much, but still. He was more modern in outlook than his father, a little less obsessed with piety, and somewhat more tolerant in religious matters. He even tried to cut back the power of the Catholic Church in politics, which for a Habsburg was basically like saying, maybe we don't need quite so much incense, but his real problem was the War of the Spanish Succession. That massive, messy conflict over who got to sit on the Spanish throne after the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, poor inbred Charles II, finally died childless. Joseph and his family were one side of the war, the French Bourbons were the other. And this war dragged on forever, draining money, men, and patience. So Joseph spent much of his short reign trying to keep the empire together while simultaneously trying not to keel over at a council meeting. Picture the man sitting at a long oak table, maps spread out, generals arguing, while he sat there with a splitting headache, jaw pain, maybe an open sore or two under his collar, pretending he cared about troop movements in northern Italy. Meanwhile, his marriage wasn't exactly thriving. Wilhelmine Amalia, his poor wife, bore him 3 daughters, no sons, which was already a disaster for the dynasty. Add to that the fact that Joseph had probably given her syphilis, and you've got a woman trapped in a palace, devoutly praying while dealing with her own declining health and her husband's complete inability to stay faithful. The daughters themselves were pale, fragile, and frequently ill. One, Leopoldine, died at just 6 years old. Another, Maria Amalia, made it to adulthood but with chronic health issues. And Maria Josepha, the eldest, would eventually marry into the Saxon royal family, dragging her hip problems with her. In other words, Joseph's legacy was not looking great. It's almost poetic, in a tragic, disgusting sort of way, that the great Habsburg dream of dynastic continuity was being quietly undermined by a microscopic bacterium. Generations of marriage contracts, wars, and alliances, all undone by one emperor who couldn't keep his trousers buttoned. By 1709. Joseph's symptoms were impossible to ignore. He had sores on his skin, severe headaches, constant fevers, and his mind was beginning to unravel. Courtiers whispered about his rages, his erratic decisions, his wild mood swings. But still, everyone had to bow and call him Your Imperial Majesty, as if nothing was wrong. And here's the strange part. Joseph kept up appearances remarkably well. He still hunted when he could. He still gave audiences, attended ceremonies, and played his role. Outwardly, he was clinging to dignity. But behind the scenes, he was falling apart. Letters from diplomats describe an emperor who looked pale, worn, and exhausted. One even noted his distracted gaze, which was courtly language, for he looks like he's not entirely here anymore. Let's drift sideways for a moment, because Joseph wasn't the only royal to suffer from syphilis. It was practically the unofficial disease of European courts. King Henry VIII of England is often suspected of having it, though historians still argue. French kings like Francis I were definitely riddled with it, and in Russia, Tsar Peter the Great's court was a hotbed of it. Honestly, if you were a monarch in the 1500s to 1700s and you didn't have syphilis, you were in the minority. But Joseph's case was especially humiliating because he was young. He wasn't some old, gout-ridden relic clinging to life. He was supposed to be the fresh face of the dynasty, and instead he was rotting away at the height of his reign. Finally, in April 1711, the disease finished its work. Joseph developed a fever that grew worse and worse. He was delirious, raving, sometimes unable to recognize those around him. The sores on his body were so bad that courtiers struggled to mask the smell. His doctors bled him, of course, weakening him further. On April 17th, at just 32 years old, Emperor Joseph I died. Officially, the cause of death was smallpox, which was a convenient cover story, because it was a lot less embarrassing to say the emperor had been struck down by smallpox, the great, noble epidemic, than to admit he had spent years rotting from syphilis. But everyone at court knew the truth. His body was placed in an elaborate coffin, carried through Vienna with all the pomp and solemnity the Habsburgs could muster. Crowds lined the streets, not to mourn. Habsburgs were never especially beloved, but out of curiosity. Because even in death, Joseph was a spectacle. The aftermath was messy. With Joseph gone and no sons left behind, the succession crisis deepened. His brother, Charles VI, took over, but Charles had his own problems, including the infamous Pragmatic Sanction to try to secure the throne for his daughter Maria Theresa later on. In short, Joseph's early death threw the dynasty into chaos, and Europe spent the next decades dealing with the fallout. But Joseph himself was soon forgotten. He reigned just 6 years. He left behind no surviving sons, and his legacy was overshadowed by his illness, his reckless private life, and his ignominious decline. Let's take a breath here. That's the end of part 2. So, Joseph I has exited the stage. Vienna has its solemn funeral procession, the bells have tolled, and the Habsburg courtiers have already moved on to fussing over the next emperor. Because in dynastic Europe, grief was always secondary to paperwork. You could lose a brother on Monday and still have to sign a treaty by Tuesday, but Joseph's death leaves us with a wider theme. The sheer number of royals who, like him, decayed from the inside out while their courts politely applauded. Joseph may have been unique in the speed and youthfulness of his decline, but he was far from alone. The 16th through 18th centuries were basically the golden age of royals rotting away in public. Let's drift first to France, because of course we do. The French kings were infamous for catching and spreading syphilis. One of the most notorious cases was Francis I, who reigned from 1515 to 1547. He was the great Renaissance monarch of France, patron of the arts, rival of Charles V, lover of glittering banquets. He was also riddled with sores, foul breath, and constant pain by the end of his life. Physicians recorded his ulcers, his fevers, and his increasingly incoherent outbursts. Imagine the King of France hosting dignitaries in the Louvre, while barely able to sit still because half his body was on fire from disease and it didn't stop with him. Henry III of France, flamboyant, eccentric, and constantly paranoid, was another one suspected of venereal disease. Courtiers whispered about lesions on his face and the endless procession of medical vapors drifting from his chambers. The French court was a perfumed mask over a very sick body, Literally dot, but if France was bad, Spain was worse. Remember Charles II of Spain? Joseph's cousin, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. He wasn't just inbred, he was basically the poster child for genetic disaster. His jaw was so distorted he could barely chew. His tongue was too big for his mouth, and his body was a collection of chronic illnesses. Charles was constantly drooling, frequently incontinent, and so weak he could barely walk by his 30s. His autopsy revealed a body riddled with fluid, with only one shriveled testicle and a heart the size of a peppercorn, not exactly the majestic image of a Catholic monarch, and yet, through all this, courtiers bowed, called him His Most Catholic Majesty, and treated him like a divinely appointed ruler. Which is a theme. No matter how much a royal rotted, stank, or twitched, etiquette required that everyone around them keep up the act. Back in Austria, Joseph's own father, Leopold I, wasn't exactly a beacon of health either. He had survived smallpox, leaving him scarred and pitted. He had the legendary Habsburg chin, massive, jutting, a symbol of centuries of intermarriage. Contemporaries described him as slow, melancholy, and perpetually gloomy. He lived into his 60s, but in a state of declining strength, plagued by fevers and constant illness. He looked like a man halfway buried before he even reached old age. Joseph's brother, Charles VI, who succeeded him, didn't fare much better. He lived longer, yes, but his reign was a slow-motion disaster. He struggled with stomach problems, kidney pain, and anxiety. He wasted away toward the end, only to die suddenly after eating a suspicious plate of mushrooms in 1740. Were they actually poisonous? Maybe, or maybe his digestive system was just too far gone after decades of illness and bad medicine. Either way, he keeled over, leaving his daughter Maria Theresa with a crisis on her hands. Let's float north now, up to England. Because if you thought the Habsburgs cornered the market on rotting monarchs, think again. King Henry VIII? Yes, the guy with the 6 wives was a physical wreck by the end of his life. By his 40s, he was obese, covered in ulcers on his legs that oozed constantly, and probably diabetic. His courtiers had to endure the stench whenever he moved. He was carried around on a mechanical chair because he could no longer walk. His temper was explosive, his decisions erratic. Basically, he was Joseph I on steroids minus the syphilis diagnosis, though some historians suspect it lurked in the background. Then there was George III a century later, the Mad King of England. His mind deteriorated in bursts, with fits of mania, hallucinations, and endless babbling. His courtiers wrote that he would talk for hours without stopping, often to himself, often incoherent. His body wasn't rotting like Joseph's, but his mind certainly was, and once again, etiquette forced everyone around him to pretend he was still ruling wisely. The pattern repeats everywhere. Monarchs were too important to be allowed to simply die of disease in private. They had to perform royalty right up until the moment they collapsed, which meant years of pretending, years of cover-ups, and years of doctors trying increasingly ridiculous cures. And speaking of cures, let's drift back to those for a moment. Because if Josephi's mercury baths sound extreme, wait until you hear what others endured. In France, one cure for syphilis was a sweatbox. They'd literally put the patient in a wooden cabinet, heat it up with coals underneath, and make them sweat until they nearly fainted. The idea was to expel the poison. More often, it just left the patient half dead from heat stroke. In England, some physicians recommended guaiacum, a kind of tree resin imported from the Americas. They called it the holy wood. Patients would drink foul-tasting decoctions made from it, which did absolutely nothing except make them gag. And then, of course, there were the endless purges, vomits, and bleedings. Monarch after monarch suffered these humiliations. Their bodies drained and poisoned in the name of treatment. But Joseph's case still stands out because he was young, handsome, promising, and syphilis cut him down before he even reached his prime. His death left his dynasty scrambling, his wife infected, and his daughters weak. He was a symbol of how fragile royal power actually was. You could wear the crown of the Holy Roman Empire, command armies, and sign treaties, and still be destroyed by a bacterium smaller than a pinhead. And that, in the end, is the story of so many monarchs. They projected immortality, divine right, eternal grandeur. But their bodies were frail, their habits reckless, and their medicine primitive. Behind the silk curtains and gilded halls, they coughed, sweated, and bled like everyone else, only with more spectators. We'll pause part 3 here. So here we are, drifting past the short, painful reign of Emperor Joseph I. By the time he died in 1711, Vienna had already wrapped him in official dignity, dressed his corpse in ceremonial robes, and written the history books to say he died of smallpox, because, of course, that was much more respectable than admitting that the emperor had spent years dissolving from syphilis while his doctors rubbed mercury on him. But Joseph's story didn't end with his burial. His decline shaped the Habsburg dynasty for decades to come, in ways that were as messy as the man's medical history. The immediate problem was succession. Joseph left behind 3 daughters but no sons. And in dynastic Europe, daughters just didn't count the same way. His younger brother Charles, later Charles VI, inherited everything. Charles was already ruling in Spain at the time, pretending to be king in opposition to the Bourbon claimant during the War of the Spanish Succession. When Joseph died, Charles had to abandon his Spanish adventure and rush back to Vienna to grab the imperial throne. This change tilted the balance of the entire war. Europe had spent a decade fighting over whether the Bourbons or the Habsburgs would inherit Spain. Suddenly, with Charles now emperor, the possibility of one man controlling both Spain and Austria terrified everyone. And so, after years of carnage, the war wound down, leaving the Bourbons with Spain and Charles with his patched-together empire. All because Joseph had partied too hard in his 20s and burned out in his 30s. It's a very Habsburg kind of twist. Dynastic politics derailed not by brilliant diplomacy or crushing battles, but by bacteria and bad decisions. Charles VI, Joseph's brother, tried desperately to shore up the dynasty after that. He had only daughters too, and so he issued the famous pragmatic sanction, basically a document saying, "Please, Europe, promise to let my daughter inherit when I die," which, spoiler alert, Europe absolutely did not honor. His daughter, Maria Theresa, had to fight the war of Austrian succession to keep what was hers. And so you can draw straight. Tragic smelling line. Joseph's early death led to Charles's desperate reforms, which led to the collapse of Habsburg stability, which plunged Europe into yet another bloody war. All because an emperor who could have reigned for decades was reduced to sores, fevers, and delirium before the age of 33. But beyond politics, Joseph left behind another legacy, the very real memory of what it meant to watch a monarch rot in public. For his wife, Wilhelmine Amalia, it was a life sentence of widowhood. She never remarried. She lived another 30 years, devout, pious, and quietly sidelined, a relic of a failed dynasty. Imagine her praying daily in her palace chapel, body weakened by the same disease her husband had passed on, watching her daughters fade one by one. She was one of those forgotten empresses the kind history barely mentions, except to note her sad fate for his daughters. The inheritance was fragile health, dynastic pressure, and marriages that carried their ailments into other noble houses. Maria Josepha became Electress of Saxony, where her descendants continued the proud European tradition of fragile, sickly heirs. Maria Amalia married into Bavaria, carrying her Habsburg baggage along with her dowry. The family tree spread, but with the same cracks Joseph had introduced, and for the empire itself, Joseph's reign was remembered as a flicker of promise cut short. Contemporaries sometimes described him as the lost hope of the Habsburgs. He had been intelligent, lively, even charismatic, qualities rare enough in the family that people noticed. His youth gave the illusion of strength, and yet, beneath the powdered wigs and silks, he was already disintegrating. It's almost too perfect a metaphor for the dynasty as a whole. Outwardly, the Habsburgs were magnificent. Their empire stretched across Central Europe. They had titles stacked like a game of Jenga: King of Hungary, King of Bohemia, Archduke of Austria, Holy Roman Emperor, and on and on. Their palaces glittered, their processions dazzled, their portraits projected eternity. And yet, like Joseph's own body, the dynasty was sick at the core. Generations of inbreeding had left their heirs weak and fragile. Their reliance on outdated medicine made every illness a death sentence. Their politics were brittle, held together with treaties that collapsed the moment a ruler died. Joseph's short, syphilitic life was just one example of the wider truth. The Habsburgs looked uncheckable until you got close enough to smell the rot. If we float back to Joseph himself. Though it's worth remembering him not just as a cautionary tale, but as a man trapped by the world he lived in. He was raised to believe he could have anything, take anyone, do anything. His position shielded him from consequences until it didn't. Syphilis was an invisible punishment, creeping in through the pleasures of youth, slowly claiming his vigor, and humiliating him at the very moment he should have been at his peak. He reigned just 6 years. He fought endless wars, signed endless papers, wore endless crowns, and left almost nothing behind except a weakened dynasty and a reputation for scandal. There are no great monuments to Joseph I, no legendary reforms, no lasting victories. Just whispers in archives about sores, mercury ointments, and a deathbed that smelled worse than a battlefield. So tonight, as you drift off, maybe picture Joseph at his best moment, a tall, confident young emperor in gleaming armor, striding into a Viennese hall with courtiers bowing low. He smiles, he radiates charm, he looks invincible. And know that behind that smile, history was already writing a very different ending. One where the emperor, like so many of his kind, rotted alive while everyone pretended not to notice. And with that, let's let Joseph rest. Because honestly, the man deserves a little peace after all that drooling, bleeding, and mercury fumigation. Good night. So technically, Joseph's story ended with his burial in 1711. But since we're here, cozy under the blankets, we can drift a little further. Because Joseph's rotting body was just one in a long gallery of royal corpses that made history slightly smellier than the painting suggests. Think of this as the after-dinner stroll of our story. The main course is done, but we're still nibbling on little details while the candles burn low. One thing that fascinates me about Joseph's decline is how common it actually was for rulers to die unpleasantly. We tend to imagine kings and emperors going out with some kind of dignity, a noble last speech, a heroic battlefield end. In reality, they usually died the same way everyone else did, slowly, painfully, and often in ways their courtiers tried very hard to cover up. Let's drift through a few of those. Take Louis XIV of France, the so-called Sun King. He reigned for 72 years, the longest of any European monarch. Outwardly, he was the grand symbol of French absolutism: palaces, fountains, armies, wigs that required scaffolding. But in 1715, at the end of his long reign, his leg began to rot. Literally, he developed gangrene. The court diaries described the smell filling his chambers. Doctors tried poultices and amputations, but nothing worked. The Sun King spent his final weeks in agony, his glorious body dissolving until he finally expired. not marry Sunny Dot or consider James VI and I King of Scotland than England. He was obsessed with witchcraft, tobacco, and personal hygiene, which is ironic because he died with his body covered in sores and his stomach distended with gas. His courtiers noted a terrible effluvium, which is a very polite way of saying he stank so badly nobody wanted to come near him. And then, of course, there's poor Charles II of England, the merry monarch. His final illness in 1685 was anything but merry. He was subjected to every torture early modern medicine could think of: bleeding, purging, blistering, enemas, and even having pigeon carcasses strapped to his head as a cure. By the time he died, it wasn't clear if the disease or the doctors had done more damage, which brings us back to Joseph. Because just like Charles, just like Louis, he suffered more from the treatments than the disease itself. Mercury, purges, bleeding, these weren't just useless, they were actively killing him faster. It's almost comical in a grim way. Monarchs, supposedly the most powerful people in the world, were still helpless patients on the wrong end of bad medicine. If we float eastward for a moment, Russia adds its own entries to the catalog of unpleasant royal endings. Ivan the Terrible, for example, was already infamous for his rages, murders, and paranoia. But by the end of his life, his body was bloated, his legs useless, his joints filled with pain. He probably suffered from syphilis as well, treated with, you guessed it, mercury. His courtiers wrote of an emperor who alternated between screaming violence and pathetic collapse. His last act? Dying during a game of chess, which is almost poetic if you ignore the smell. Peter the Great too rotted in his own way. His bladder was riddled with infection. Doctors cut into him multiple times, draining pus and blood. The final surgery left him screaming, only to relapse and die in torment in 1725. Man who had dragged Russia into the modern age was reduced to a wheezing, infective husk. The more you line these stories up, the more Joseph's fate feels less like an exception and more like a rule. European monarchs didn't age gracefully. They didn't go quietly. They decayed, they rotted, and their courts worked overtime to make sure nobody outside the palace walls knew just how bad it was. The paintings, of course, tell a different story. Oil portraits always show them flawless, powdered, armored, bejeweled. Joseph's portraits are no different. You see him in brocade and lace, his jawline strong, his gaze confident. You don't see the sores on his scalp, the trembling hands, the feverish sweat staining his linen. That was the job of portraiture, to lie. To give us the illusion of immortal power, even as the subject was falling apart, and that's maybe the most fitting way to remember Joseph I. He was a man trapped between image and reality. Outwardly, he was the dashing young emperor with a promising future. In reality, he was a 30-year-old rotting from the inside. Poisoned by both his disease and his treatments, his courtiers clapped. His doctors bled him. His wife prayed. His empire kept rolling forward, wars raging, treaties signed, palaces lit, and then one day he was gone, replaced by another Habsburg face and another Habsburg portrait, and the world pretended, as always, that nothing had changed. So as you drift to sleep tonight, maybe let that be the takeaway. Behind every polished royal portrait, behind every glittering crown, there's a very human body. One that aches, coughs, sweats, and decays. Even emperors, even kings, even the handsome Habsburgs like Joseph the First Power can't save you from bacteria. Crowns don't stop rot. And sometimes history really is just a long story of important people pretending the emperor doesn't smell good night. So Joseph is buried. Curtains closed, bells tolled, empire shuffled onward. But if you think death actually meant peace, well, you clearly haven't spent enough time around royal corpses. Because, as history repeatedly reminds us, Kings and queens don't always stay quietly in their coffins. Let's float into the fascinatingly unpleasant world of postmortem royal drama. First, Joseph himself. He was interred in the Imperial Crypt in Vienna, the Kaisergruft, where generations of Habsburgs still lie, or at least their remains do. The crypt was, in theory, a dignified resting place. In practice, it became an oddly theatrical tradition. You see, the Habsburgs had a habit of splitting themselves up after death. Hearts in one church, entrails in another, bodies in the crypt. It was a whole organ donation program. Centuries before it was trendy, Joseph's remains followed this pattern. His bowels went to St. Stephen's Cathedral. His heart was deposited in the Herzgruft, or heart crypt, and the rest of him stayed in the Kaisergruft. Imagine being the poor attendants who had to scoop out a syphilitic emperor's insides before rigor mortis set in. Not exactly a glamorous task, but hey, it was Vienna in 1711. Someone had to do it. And of course, embalming wasn't exactly perfect. Early 18th century techniques involved a lot of spices, alcohol, and guesswork. Even the best efforts couldn't stop decay entirely. More than once, visitors to the crypt have reported the faint, lingering scent of, well, not roses, but Joseph's postmortem indignities are small potatoes compared to some of his royal colleagues. Take Henry VIII, for example. The bloated Tudor monarch died in 1547, and his coffin, being a bit undersized for his massive frame, began to leak. At Sion Abbey, where his body rested overnight, a dog reportedly licked up the fluids seeping from his casket. Contemporary writers swore it was divine justice. Not exactly the dignified repose of a king or poor Louis XVIII of France. He was so overweight that when he died in 1824, decomposition set in almost immediately. The smell grew so unbearable during the funeral that mourners literally gagged in the cathedral. And this was after liberal dousing in perfume and herbs. Imagine being trapped in a hot church with that. Sometimes, though, the drama came long after the funeral. In Spain, for instance, the royal pantheon at El Escorial has a notorious feature called the Padredero, or rotting room. When a monarch dies, their body is placed there for decades to, well, liquefy until only bones are left. Only then can they join the marble tombs. So yes, there's a special room in Spain dedicated to slowly decomposing kings. Somewhere, Joseph's ghost might be grateful Austria didn't borrow that custom dot, and in England, Oliver Cromwell's corpse had its own posthumous humiliation. Dug up after the Restoration, it was hanged, decapitated, and his head stuck on a spike. Imagine rotting quietly for years, only to be dragged back out for one last political statement. But perhaps the strangest tale belongs to Charles XII of Sweden. He died in battle in 1718, shot through the head. For centuries, rumors swirled about whether it was an enemy bullet or an assassination from his own men. In the 20th century, his coffin was opened to investigate. The body was remarkably well preserved, the hole still visible. Imagine being disturbed hundreds of years after death, only to be treated like forensic evidence on a cold case file. Even Napoleon didn't escape corpse drama. Buried on St. Helena in 1821, his body was exhumed nearly 2 decades later and reportedly found to be astonishingly intact. Some said it was proof of poisoning by arsenic, others whispered of miracles. More likely, it was just the damp, airtight coffin doing its job. But of course, legends about preserved emperors are always more fun than the science dot. So why do these stories matter for Joseph I? Because they remind us that royalty, even in death, remained part of the performance. The living used their corpses, sometimes literally, to send messages. A leaking coffin could be divine punishment. A preserved body could be proof of sainthood. A rotten stench could be quietly ignored in favor of pomp and ritual. Joseph's embalming and burial were meant to project dignity. But anyone who knew him in life would have remembered the sores, the smells, the syphilitic decline. The split-up organs were just one more mask, a way of arranging the remains into something that looked traditional and orderly. Underneath, it was the same story as always, a human body, returning to dust, and maybe that's the best way to end our drift. Joseph I, the young Habsburg emperor who should have ruled for decades, instead became a hushed-up medical disaster. His life was short, his death was ugly, and his body was divided, embalmed, and locked away among marble coffins that pretended to tell a cleaner story. But history remembers the details. The rot, the mercury, the fumbling doctors. And tonight, so close your eyes. Let the images of candlelit crypts, creaking coffins, and powdered monarchs slowly fading away drift into the background. And remember, even emperors can't outwit the worms. Good night. We've walked Joseph into the grave. We've peeked at his embalming. We've even compared his coffin drama to other royal stinkers. But now let's pull back a little. Because Joseph's fate wasn't just a personal misfortune. It was part of a long Habsburg tradition of treating death like theater dot. And when it comes to staging death, the Habsburgs had some of the best box seats in Europe. The imperial family didn't just die quietly. Their passings were rituals, carefully choreographed displays of power, humility, and symbolism. Think of it as the ultimate final act, complete with costumes, music, and props that when a Habsburg monarch died, the first order of business was to split them up, literally. The body was divided, entrails, heart and corpse all buried separately in different churches. This wasn't just practical, though. Yes, organs rot faster. It was symbolic. The heart went to one place of devotion, the intestines to another, the body, the grand centerpiece, to the crypt beneath the Capuchin church in Vienna. This ritual division became so ingrained that you can actually map Habsburg piety by their organs. St. Stephen's Cathedral became a veritable collection of intestines. The Augustinian church filled with hearts. And the Kaisergraf gathered the increasingly crowded collection of coffins stacked in neat but eerie rows. And the funerals, they weren't just somber events. They were pageants. Imagine torchlit processions, velvet-draped hearses, choirs chanting mournfully, and endless sermons about duty, piety, and legacy. Of course, beneath all the glitter, there was always the quiet reality. The corpse inside was already decomposing, and the priests were trying to disguise the smell with incense. One particular famous ritual was the knocking ceremony. When the coffin of a deceased emperor arrived at the Capuchin monastery, it couldn't just be carried straight in. Oh, no. Protocol required a monk to ask who was seeking entry. The herald would answer with all the emperor's titles. King of Hungary, Archduke of Austria, Lord of blah blah, all the usual Habsburg word salad. The monk would reply, "We do not know him," then a shorter list of titles. Again, "We do not know him." Finally, the herald would say, "A poor mortal and sinful man." Only then would the doors open, and the coffin could enter. It was supposed to symbolize humility before God, but in practice, it probably came across as a very elaborate password check at the gates of heaven. By Joseph's time, the Kaisergraft itself was already a morbid tourist attraction. Rows of elaborate sarcophagi lined the crypt, decorated with skulls, angels, crowns, and weeping cherubs. Later Habsburg coffins got downright Baroque. Maria Theresa's enormous double coffin with her husband, for example, looks more like a cathedral centerpiece than a burial box. Joseph's own coffin, by contrast, is fairly restrained. A little decoration, a little gilt, but nothing too extravagant. Perhaps that's fitting, since his reign was short and his death inconvenient. He didn't get the blockbuster funeral of a long-reigning monarch. Just enough ceremony to remind everyone that yes, this was still an emperor, even if he was a syphilitic one. The irony, of course, is that while the Habsburgs put so much effort into staging death, their dynasty itself slowly decayed from within, inbreeding fragile heirs, endless succession crises. The Capuchin crypt is less a monument to eternal glory than a gallery of dynastic fragility. Joseph's younger brother, Charles VI, who succeeded him, would die leaving only daughters, sparking yet another European war. Maria Theresa would spend her life defending the throne, all while watching her children suffer the same mix of ill health and dynastic duty. By the time you get to the last Habsburg emperor, Charles I in 1922, the grand rituals had lost their meaning. He died in exile, penniless, coughing his lungs out from pneumonia, his coffin a far cry from the Baroque splendor of earlier emperors. The Habsburgs began their tradition of elaborate burials as a way to cement power. But by the end, those marble coffins were more like reminders of how far the dynasty had fallen. So when you picture Joseph, lying among his ancestors in the dim crypt under Vienna, try to imagine not just his own story, but the larger tapestry. A family obsessed with appearances, a dynasty that treated death as a pageant, a collection of emperors and empresses, each embalmed, divided, and ceremonially denied at the door before being allowed to join the ever-growing lineup of bones. And in the end, for all the pomp, they ended up like everyone else. Bodies in boxes. Maybe that's the quiet punchline of Habsburg history. You can gild your coffin, split your organs across cathedrals, and have monks quiz your corpse at the gates. But none of it changes the reality underneath. The emperor rotted, the dynasty rotted, and all that's left now is a crypt full of silent reminders that no amount of power, no amount of ritual could stop the Worms. So let's leave Joseph there, among his family, wrapped in velvet, covered in guilt, embalmed in vain. One more chapter in a long, decaying library of emperors who all tried and failed to look eternal. Good night.